I would like to begin first and foremost by acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional territories today of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe First Nations here in the city of Ottawa. We at Stop Ecocide Canada are extremely grateful to be able to have this event here today and to speak, listen, and learn on these beautiful lands, which have been shaped and preserved and cared for by First Nations people since time immemorial. Et nous sommes très heureux de vous voir tous ici en cet événement historique sur la colline du Parlement pour parler à la loi Ecocide. We are very grateful for you to be here today. We would like to acknowledge that unfortunately we do not have simultaneous translation and we'd like to apologize. But I would like to take a quick moment to invite up Monique Pauzet from the Bloc Québécois, who is one of the sponsoring parties of this event, to speak briefly.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Alors, je vous accueille donc avec quelques mots en français. D'abord, pour vous dire écocide, ce mot-là. Moi, quand j'ai invité mes collègues à venir ce soir à cette réception, et quand j'ai dit le mot écocide, ils m'ont tous regardé comme « Hein? Quoi? Qu'est-ce que c'est? De quoi tu parles? » Alors, je leur ai dit de venir, mais là, j'espère qu'ils vont m'écouter. Alors, écocide, dans le fond, je veux dire, c'est un mot qui existe depuis 1970, puis on va parler des fois d'homicide, de féminicide. Donc, écocide, dans le fond, c'est je viens de tuer ma maison. Je viens de tuer ce qui nous fait vivre. Alors, ça devrait nous enrager, j'ai le goût de dire. Je sais qu'Ecocide est mobilisé à travers le monde et c'est fantastique, j'applaudis à ça. Mais je trouve que vous avez beaucoup de courage pour parler de ça ici au Canada dans un État pétrolier. Et je trouve déplorable que nos gouvernements aient trop de docilité à écouter les compagnies pétrolières et gazières qui font un lobby très, très, très intense. Alors, je dis souvent que devant l'indignation, hein, on devrait, des fois, il y en a qui pensent à de la résignation. Moi, devant l'indignation, je vais plutôt parler d'action. Et le sujet de cet atelier va être très intéressant pour mobiliser les élus, espérons-le, oui, et susciter des réflexions et surtout, surtout, incarner la part d'action qui doit être la nôtre. Donc, les trois saints, s'indigner, s'informer, s'impliquer. Alors, il faudrait pratiquer ça. Merci.
Merci, Monique. And Monique Pauzet is on the Standing Committee of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our second presentation on Parliament Hill on the topic of ecocide, a law to criminalize the mass destruction of nature. Our first event in November was very well received and included cross-party participation at the first ever press conference on ecocide law in Canada. We are thrilled to be able to say that this event has once again drawn interest from multiple political parties. And I'd like to take this moment to thank the following offices for sponsoring this event. Thank you to the office of Elizabeth May, Party Leader for the Green Party of Canada. Thank you to the office of Deputy Leader Alexandre Boularice of the NDP. Thank you to the office of Monique Pauzet of the Bloc Québécois. And thank you to the office of MP Patrick Weiler for the Liberal Party of Canada. We would also like to thank our partners at CPIJ, the Canadian Partnership on International Justice, and of course, Stop Ecocide Canada. In a moment, I will be introducing you to our panel of expert speakers, but before we begin, I would like to give you a brief update on the Stop Ecocide International campaign and tell you why this is such an exciting yet also critical time in history to be having this conversation. At a climate strike recently, I heard one of the youth activists say something that stuck with me. She said, each generation, it seems, has had their fight, whether that be to end segregation, fight for women's right to vote, to choose peace over war, or to fight for the right for everyone to be able to marry. Those of us alive on the planet today, particularly the youth, find ourselves squarely situated in the fight to save our home, the only planet known to be able to sustain human life. The Earth and Earth's ecosystems are under threat. And scientists from around the world have concluded that we have a very limited window of time to reduce our emissions and stop the overconsumption of Earth's resources, or else we face catastrophic consequences. The defining fight of this generation is clear. We must end ecocide. The good news is, since the release of the proposed definition of ecocide by an independent expert panel in June of 2021, we have seen tremendous momentum behind the movement to make ecocide an international crime. In January of this year, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution calling on member states to update their laws to codify the crime of ecocide, and expressed strong support for efforts to include ecocide as an international crime under the International Criminal Court. In March, the European Parliament proposed including ecocide into the EU's revised directive on protection of the environment through criminal law. And of course, in a landmark resolution just last year in July of 2022, the UN General Assembly recognized the universal right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and called upon states, businesses, and others to scale up efforts in this regard. This brings us to our topic for today. With these developments come questions. With an incoming new law on the horizon, what does that mean for business, for industry? How do we adapt our current systems to work within planetary boundaries? What role could finance and investment play in supporting the goals of an ecocide law? My name is Dana Dolazar. I'm a filmmaker, activist, and student of sustainability management and volunteer organizer with Stop Ecocide Canada. I am honored and thrilled to be able to moderate this panel discussion today. And without further ado, sans plus attendre, let me introduce you to our esteemed speakers. First up is Robert Walker. Robert is a sustainability policy manager for the International Corporate Governance Network, an investor-led organization with assets under management of $70 trillion, which has for the second year running called on governments to criminalize ecocide. Robert has 30 years of experience in the sustainable investing field, helping lead the development of the industry in Canada and internationally. He formerly served as executive director of the Responsible Investment Association and vice president and head of ESG services at NEI Investments, a leading Canadian asset manager focused on sustainable investing. He is a climate governance expert for Canadian Climate Law Initiative established by the University of British Columbia and York University. And Robert is the recipient of a 2021 Clean 50 Lifetime Achievement Award. Hari Balasubramanian. Hari Balasubramanian is a proven sustainability expert who is driven by the belief that all types of capital can be deployed to achieve impact. He has worked alongside over 300 projects in 5 languages and 60 plus countries, influencing over $4 billion in sustainability-oriented financing. He is the founder of Eco Advisors and Eco Investors Capital, which advise and invest for sustainability at scale. Previously, Hari led impact due diligence, measurement, and reporting at Conservation International. He currently serves as director for several environmental charities and funds. He is a mentor to startups, an advisor to investors, corporates, and governments on the value of nature and future of sustainability. In 2021, Clean Leaders recognized Hari as Canada's top impact consultant enabler. Anna Clark. Anna is a third-year student studying public policy, history, writing, and rhetoric at the University of Toronto. She is currently the co-director of Stop Ecocide Toronto and the youth liaison for Stop Ecocide Canada. Additionally, Anna is a debater at the University of Toronto Hart House team, competing nationally and internationally. Outside of environmental advocacy and debate, Anna is interested in housing policy and healthcare policy and has an upcoming publication in the UJAS Journal. She has also worked as a compliance analyst for the G20 Research Group and writer for the ESSA Undergraduate Journal. Joining us via Zoom is Lisa Oldring. Lisa is a lawyer specialized in international human rights law with 20 years of past practice with the UN and other international organizations. She was a senior advisor with the UN Human Rights Office on counterterrorism and security issues and assistant to the first UN Special Rapporteur on Health. She served as legal advisor to the UN-mandated International Commissions of Inquiry on Darfur and Lebanon, and with the UN Human Rights Field Operation in Rwanda. Lisa is an advisor to Stop Ecocide International and a board member with Avocats Sans Frontières. Her doctoral research at the University of Amsterdam focuses on ecocide crime from a human rights perspective. We would like to invite each of our speakers now to take a couple of minutes to give their opening remarks. Then we will have a series of prepared questions and then some time for audience questions. And then we will have an opportunity to socialize and have food and drink at the end. So we do hope you join us and stay till the end. So I will now turn things over to Hari for your opening remarks.
What's that? Perfect. Well, thanks very much for that wonderful introduction. Look, as was described, I run two businesses that sit at the interface between capital in all its forms and environmental productivity around the world. We built these businesses to respond to a market failure. So I come from a nonprofit background. I thought the way to save the world was through nonprofit activities and using philanthropic dollars to address issues of climate change and environmental sustainability, biodiversity loss. But in 2011, I was sitting at The Hague, and I heard a shocking statistic from the European Commission that published a report in 2011, that we spend globally over half of global GDP actively destroying the planet. At that time, that was roughly $45 trillion a year. I thought to myself, I was working for one of the largest environmental nonprofits, Conservation International. At that time, we had partners with all of the largest governments investing in nature and biodiversity loss and climate change. We worked with the biggest foundations and families. We worked with the World Bank and the UN. And I wrote on the back of a piece of paper, how much money were we spending actively protecting the environment? The number I came up with at that time, which has been confirmed by the Paulson report more recently, was about $45 billion a year. I sat back and said, what the hell are we doing, right? If we're spending 1/1000th of the amount protecting the planet that sustains us relative to global forces that are spending 1,000 times more actively destroying the asset base that we work on, there's no point. We're not going to achieve the goals of climate change mitigation, biodiversity loss, and preservation of the thing that sustains humanity on this planet. So we built these businesses to say, look, there's another pathway. We can actually do things in a productive way for the economy without destroying the underlying basis of global value. I want to talk a little bit about those other sectors, though, as well. So corporations were created in the first place not to be solely for the basis of shareholder supremacy and stockholders. Corporations were actually created for public benefit back in the 17th and 18th century. We bastardized the role of the corporation in the private sector to focus on shareholder value. And that actually is based on a legal decision that was made about 100 years ago. So there's a story in the Michigan State Supreme Court where the Dodge brothers, who were shareholders of the Ford Motor Company, took Henry Ford to court. Henry Ford wanted to pay his workers an adequate wage in the factory line to build the Model T. And his thesis was that if we can demonstrate that factory workers can afford to buy a passenger vehicle at the end of a year's of work, then we can sell more of this product. He had no motivation for social change. He also wanted to provide insurance for his workers, health insurance, because he found that people that were off the assembly line that didn't have health insurance, it was hard to replace them and it cost more money and it was inefficient and they couldn't build more Model Ts. The Dodge brothers said, that's going to cut into our dividends. And we want money now because we have gambling debts and we're drunkards, basically is the subtext. And they didn't say that. But this went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and Judge Russell Ostrander in 1919 declared this notion of shareholder supremacy, which is a legal precedent that was set, which bastardized the role of corporation in the world. So we're trying to transition that through the work that we do in our businesses, through consulting and advising other corporations, that you can do good and do well at the same time. And actually, your responsibility as a corporation should be for more public benefit while making money as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that relates to international criminal code, but I think the legal basis for the criminalization of ecocide is one tool in the tool belt to understand what really underpins the value of the global economy. We need other tools as well, but this is a great basis of conversation and a starting point to really understand why the planet, nature, and the complexity of nature is really important and underpinning. And one last thing I'll say is that the Paulson report also outlined to us that the amount that nature provides to the global economy is almost equivalent to that number that we're spending actively destroying it. So they say half or more of nature is moderately or more dependent on nature as the basis of value creation for global GDP. And I would argue that 100% of global GDP is reliant on nature, because without nature, humans don't exist, and without humans, GDP doesn't exist.
Thank you, Hari. I'll now pass it to Anna for your opening remarks.
Yes, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm honored by the invitation and the ability to speak here to all of you. It was fine, and then it wasn't. You got it. Je vous remercie de m'accueillir ici aujourd'hui. Je suis honorée de l'invitation et de la possibilité de m'adresser à vous. I care, I worry, I love, I'm frustrated, and I'm scared are all things youth wrote when signing our open letter from Canadian Youth, in which over 600 of youth under 30 in Canada call on the Canadian government to declare support for making ecocide an international crime. From the moment we enter the world, a ticking clock hangs over our heads. How long do we have until nothing is salvageable? There's an untenable apprehension and fear embedded in our very bones. At 21, I look to the future hoping for excitement of the unknown, and am instead faced with the burden of knowing that our collective futures rest on our actions now. We care is a common platitude trotted out by the business sector. We care about the environment enough to pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030. But where is the accountability? Where is intergenerational equity? We care can only carry us so far. What does caring do to fix the lack of work experience and the imminent skills gap when the green transition occurs? Nous craignons que la détérioration de l'environnement n'aggrave le chômage frictionnel et ne contribue non seulement à créer des dommages environnementaux, mais aussi créer des conditions économiques extrêmement difficiles. Nous craignons que les entreprises soient trop concentrées sur le potentiel d'actifs échoués pour aller de l'avant et mettre en œuvre des changes significants. We love. We fight because we love, because we want there to be a world to grow old in, because some of my favorite memories from when I was younger, not that I'm that old now, come from being outdoors, hiking the Skyline Range in Alberta, or canoeing in Killarney, or watching the sunset off of Vancouver Island, or standing in the surf in Nova Scotia. Nous sommes frustrés que nos voix ne soient pas étendues, que nos préoccupations ne soient pas prises en considération. Il s'agit de notre avenir, de notre monde. Nous avons peur. Chaque minute d'inaction est plus dans le cercueil proverbial de l'avenir. In short, we have everything to lose. There are two old camping maxims that I was taught that seem particularly fitting for this situation. The first, pack it in, pack it out, and leave it better than you found it. Those in power now, whether it be in the business or political sector, have a responsibility not only to leave the world as they found it, but to leave behind a better world. Not simply because they have responsibilities to their constituents or consumers, but because we need them to care, to worry, to love, to be frustrated, and to be scared. To achieve that fundamental shift in cost-benefit analysis, there must also occur a value shift in turn. Je le sais parce que je me soucie, je m'inquiète, j'aime, je suis frustrée, et j'ai peur. I know this because I care, I worry, I love, I'm frustrated, and I'm scared. Thank you, merci.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to turn things over to Bob for opening remarks, and then Lisa.
C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. Those are two extremely hard acts to follow. So I'll start with my own personal story. I do think it ends up in an optimistic place. I came out of the University of Toronto in 1990 into a deep recession in that province. And a friend of mine had started up an organization called the Social Investment Organization, now called the Responsible Investment Association. And somehow he had managed to get a research contract out of the provincial government at that time, led by Bob Ray, to look into how the province might support the development of what was called then community investment vehicles. And that was my first gig in this space. So here we are, more than 30 years later. We ran the first conference on sustainable or socially responsible investing in 1991 in Toronto. Very bare bones. And I remember that we spent the evening before making a banner for it that we'd hang behind the back of the podium. I can't remember the name of the conference, but it had the word environment in it. And as I was sitting in the front row waiting for my friend Mark to start up the conference, I noticed that we had misspelled the word environment. We left out one of the N. The first N was gone. So I said, we got to take that down. He goes, no one will notice. Anyway, we left it up, and the conference was quite a success. And I think one of my happiest memories was we had a professor in the Department of Geography, Merritt Gertler, who had been my thesis advisor, working on the Ontario winemaking industry for industrial policy. And Merritt was at that conference. And today, just a few years ago, the University of Toronto Asset Management began to take steps towards integrating environmental, social, and governance criteria into their investment decision-making, began a stewardship program to work with companies that they own to improve their environmental, social, and governance practices. We have a conference, my current organization, ICGN, has a conference next month in Toronto. Merrick's invited. I hope to see him there, but this seems like a nice way to close the circle. We are at ICGN somewhere close to $80 trillion in assets under management. Not everybody's doing everything right, but it is the largest asset owners and largest asset managers on the planet, including the Canada Pension Plan, PSP Investment Management, the people who got us into the door today, Ontario Teachers, the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, all the big institutions around in Norway, Japan, US, CalPERS, CalSTRS, they're all members. So it is a matter of the right people are in the room. They might not be doing the right thing yet, but interest is beginning to peak, and it is coming quite quickly. One of the challenges around ecocide or biodiversity is it's being piled on top of climate risk, which does not make things easier. And it seems the risks are coming fast and furious at this stage. And people are starting to care for a number of reasons. I think personal reasons. We can all see it. We can all feel it. Some days we're breathing it. They can see it in their portfolios. Insurance companies in California now are looking to stop providing house insurance, home insurance. That's going to have knock-on effects. That's just one small example. And they are getting to the apocalyptic. That's to Harry's point. I think they're coming to the realization that nature, life on this planet, is material to investment decision-making. That's coming now, and I think that did spark the interest in kind of a harsh kind of language, if I can say, around ecocide. It gets your attention. And I think a few years ago, the idea that our members would endorse the addition of ecocide to the realm statutes would have been a stretch. This time around, it came from them. So here we are, and that's not the only thing we're doing on biodiversity. We'll come back to that in a bit, but it is, I think, a sea change is happening right now. And again, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think we have to be optimistic, don't we? And so that's where we're at. I'll look forward to speaking a bit further about what's happening on this front and with regard to biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Bob. We're really grateful to have you here. And we would like to turn things over to Lisa for her opening remarks. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks to the other panelists. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis enchantée de vous joindre virtuellement ce soir. I'm also a worrier and an optimist. I believe change is possible. And just as others are sharing anecdotes, I'll start with one as well. 20 years ago, I was working for the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, in Switzerland, so one of the banking capitals of the world. And I found myself in a conversation with an investment advisor who worked with one of the biggest banks. And I asked him, what assurances could you give somebody that was coming to invest their money, that their money would go towards environmentally sound and human rights supportive investments? And he laughed and literally said, what do you even mean That's not the bank's job. And I think today it's pretty clear that financial institutions are fully aware that it is actually their responsibility to align investment with social and planetary realities. So, I believe that criminalizing ecocide is one of the measures that will help them to do so. I just wanted to start to sort of contextualize the momentum to criminalize ecocide, because it's not happening in a vacuum. It's responding to a groundswell of demand for clear boundaries and for meaningful and effective accountability. And it's a demand that's active across sectors in society, from the young people like Anna, but also like the Pacific Island youth students that are behind the initiative brought by Vanuatu recently to push the International Court of Justice for guidance on states' legal obligations to protect the climate. To the group of senior women that has taken legal action to the European Court of Human Rights recently against Switzerland for its failure to take effective climate action. To the environmental defenders that successfully brought a multinational corporation to court to align its policies and practices with the Paris Agreement. To the business and investor organizations like the ICGN and others, and the many other stakeholders that are urging states to collaborate internationally to criminalize ecocide. And of course, with this momentum, there are huge questions around how a crime of ecocide might be interpreted. And so today I just wanted to highlight two developments in human rights law, because I think these are important in their own right, but also because I think they offer tools that can support the criminalization of ecocide and also inform its interpretation in ways that are relevant to businesses. And the first is the landmark declaration that Dana referred to by the UN General Assembly last year, that access to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a universal human right. It's not yet a legally binding obligation under international law, but it builds on a strong foundation. And I think this is where its strength comes from, because it's a right that's already recognized in the national laws of more than 150 states. And yesterday, Canada took important steps to recognize the right to a healthy environment in federal law here. From this foundation, we have a set of framework principles and good practices, thanks to the work of UN special rapporteurs, to guide the procedural and substantive content of this right. So in other words, to help spell out what this actually means in practical terms. Governments now need to incorporate these into policies and into effective legal frameworks. But I think recognizing an international crime of ecocide can sort of bookend the right to a healthy environment by ensuring criminal accountability for the most serious violations. The second development worth mentioning, and I hesitate to do this with real experts on the panel, but is the significant increase in corporate human rights and environmental due diligence regimes that are inspired by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, because these have sort of become a dominant regulatory tool. And many companies already recognize that effective due diligence is a means for them to raise the bar and ensure sustainable business performance. And where these regimes align with the UN guiding principles and where they're comprehensive, they offer an internationally accepted benchmark that's adaptable to different corporate circumstances. And I think the other interesting thing is this push, including by many businesses, for these regimes to become mandatory, which is important given the relative ineffectiveness of the voluntary regimes. And courts have also begun to interpret the human rights responsibilities of corporations for environmental harms, drawing on the human rights frameworks enshrined in the UN guiding principles. So I think these are standards that can help provide clarity on what's expected of corporate actors. And I'd even go a step further and say they can potentially help to delineate when conduct may become criminally wrongful in the context of ecocide. And this is work that we've been looking at with others, including Kate McIntosh, Darrell Robinson, and so on. It's difficult to imagine that a business leader that has complied with a comprehensive due diligence requirement could have acted with reckless disregard for excessive environmental damage. And so I see these frameworks, the crime of ecocide and human rights framework, acting together in ways that are relevant, complementary, and sort of mutually reinforcing, and that can help businesses course correct and operate within the planetary boundaries. So I'll stop here, but look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm actually going to put the first question to Lisa while we have you there and kind of follow up on something that you were speaking about. You mentioned that ecocide crime and human rights law can be mutually reinforcing approaches. How do you see this as helpful for business? I
mean, it's true that states have made important commitments to the environment. Just sort of zooming out and looking at the global environmental governance framework. But the inadequacies of this framework are widely known, and it's clear that compliance and enforcement is a serious problem. And human rights law has sort of stepped in to fill a gap over the last few years. The international human rights system, national institutions, and courts have helped, as I was referring to earlier, clarify the obligations and responsibilities of states and businesses. And they've had some limited success in helping hold states and corporate actors to account for their actions or inactions. But there are some pretty obvious limitations to what this people-centered framework, the human rights law, can do to ensure accountability for really serious harms to the environment. And there are particular challenges, I think, where transnational corporations are concerned. And I think this is really where recognizing a crime of ecocide can help, introducing individual criminal accountability for extreme environmental damage, in the same way really that individual responsibility for gross human rights violations was created by earlier criminal law. I think also the potential for individual criminal accountability for severe harms could bolster the importance of corporate due diligence. So it can, I think in this way, help to protect against process-oriented box-ticking exercises and ensure instead that it helps to drive meaningful change. So, I mean, I said I'm an optimist, so that's my my belief. I think these frameworks can interact in this mutually reinforcing way, and in a sense become this part of a smart mix of measures, and that's what's called for in the UN Guiding Principles, that combination of mandatory, voluntary, national and international measures that are needed to effectively foster business respect for people and the planet.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm going to put the second question to Hari. So Hari, what reservations might businesses have about the prospect of an ecocide law, and what do you think might be done to assuage them?
So it's a great question. I think I'm going to break this down into three kind of sections. So I think whether or not businesses have reservations, I think there's an inertia hurdle to get over. People don't like to change. Business as usual is easy. Change is different, right? So I think that's the first hurdle we need to get over, and we need to incentivize that change in a way that makes sense and materially makes sense. Whether that's through reversing perverse subsidies into productive subsidies, to encourage activities that promote sort of nature protection, or whatever it is. So I think the inertia hurdle is a big one. I think once we get over that inertia hurdle in terms of going towards action, I think one of the biggest issues is going to be clear bounds and rules and regulations around what this actually means and what the thresholds are. Because the risk, if you talk about ecocide, and as Bob pointed out, it's a very strong word, and the risk to business leaders is like, oh no, like if any activity that's destroying nature in some way is considered ecocide, then I can't do anything, right? So we need to have a clear sort of rule book and framework and guiding principles, and that needs to be communicated in a very simple way, because people, A, don't like to change, B, don't like to learn, and C, don't like to move, right? So, and I think the third piece is a legal risk. We're talking about criminalizing ecocide, but the reverse is also true. As we see the advent of, the asset managers that you work with, Bob, that are taking this very seriously from a materiality perspective, from a downside risk protection and also upside value creation perspective. The pushback from the other side saying that environmental considerations are not adhering to your fiduciary responsibility is very real. So the legal risk about being a first mover in this space to truly value the asset base that we should, which is nature, which has been treated as an externality for a long time, is very real. And we're seeing that right now. South of the border, there's plenty of legal cases against institutional investors that are probably part of your network, right? That have made net zero commitments. New York City pension funds, for example, 2 weeks ago, there's a class action lawsuit saying that your net zero commitment is against the fiduciary responsibility you have to guarantee our pension benefits, which is asinine, right? Because the returns show that you're going to make more money with a net zero strategy. So I think providing a clear guidance around the connection between fiduciary responsibility, between downside risk protection of the volatility of not considering climate and the environment in terms of your investment decision making is actually a long-term risk, especially for longer term investors like pension funds and institutional investors that have a long-term investment horizon. And also the upside potential of value creation that you could actually, in the environment right now where regulations in Europe, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, are actually promoting and creating sort of lower cost of capital and economic incentives and financial incentives to make these investments perform better than business as usual. It's actually consistent with your fiduciary responsibility. We need to remove this sort of barrier that people think, well, if I'm doing good for the world, socially or environmentally, it's going to be at a trade-off to my financial performance. That's no longer true. I think we really need to provide a simple explanation of why that's no longer true, and help people understand, make business decisions.
Thank you. And that transitions perfectly into my next question, which is, Bob, can you tell us why has ICGN supported the criminalization of ecocide?
Before I do, I just wanted, it's all been a very rich conversation, and I'm just writing things down. I think a couple of things. One thing Harry said around some of the lawsuits happening in the U.S. legislation at the state level to prevent fiduciaries from exercising their fiduciary duty strikes me as insane, and will be challenged in court. And I see that you can't prevent a fiduciary from discharging their fiduciary duty. And it makes no sense for a party that has historically celebrated free markets to all of a sudden tell investors what to invest in. This strikes me as this makes no sense, but there's lots of that happening around the world. So the other one is just Harry's point around inertia. I mean, I think we'd have spending time on Bay Street, a little bit of time on Wall Street in the city. In London, there is a powerful and arrogant, somewhat toxic culture in those places, and that's also part of the inertia, right? That if these things were important, we know about them. Since we don't know about them, they can't be important. And I think what's changing there is generational. Quite frankly, a new generation is coming in, and the people who we got in early, maybe a bit younger than me, but people I hired have now made their way into much larger institutions. So there has been this infiltration strategy. Wish we thought of it, but it's just kind of happened. So why ICGN and support for Ecocide law? Well, there's lots happening when it comes to the biodiversity agenda right now. Its links to climate change have been made very, very clear. It's linked to climate change in complex and dynamic ways. It's not the same as climate change, so its complexity doesn't help investors wrap their minds around it, but they're getting there. And I think what they want to see is that kind of clarity, right? Where can we go? Where can't we go? But I think part of what we do at ICGN speaks to the issue of stewardship. So taking on action as stewards of your investors to engage companies in an active dialogue around environmental and social issues. Lisa's remarks were interesting, I thought, in terms of the role of the UNGP, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I don't know if Lisa would share this view, but I think the theory of change some might have is that the drive towards building the UNGPs came because a number of U.S. companies were being threatened with lawsuits over human rights violations under the Alien Tort Claims Act in the U.S. They didn't go forward, but that threat alone got corporations thinking much more seriously about due diligence on human rights and beginning to incorporate those procedures into their business operations and their governance policies. I can see the same thing happening with Ecocide, that it is a strong word, that it'll be a motivator to get companies to follow through on their due diligence. And we're seeing that happen in corporations, but also, as Lisa again alluded to, in the European Union, there is legislation now going into place on due diligence procedures. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is becoming part of EU practice, and it's going to have a significant effect on how corporations perform their due diligence on biodiversity, on climate change, and a whole range of other risks. And that's where the rubber will hit the road when it comes to large public companies, maybe not providing the solutions that Harry is looking for in his funds, but I think when it comes to getting those companies to at least to begin to mitigate their negative impacts, that's where this will go for that part of the market.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Question for Anna. So can we talk a little bit about greenwashing? Why is greenwashing such a concern when talking about businesses tackling climate change and biodiversity loss? Where have you seen this, and how could an Ecocide law potentially help with reducing company greenwashing?
Similar to Bob's response, this is going to be a little bit circular, so stay with me. Now, your mention of Merrick Gertler reminded me of something. For those who don't know, Merrick Gertler is the current president of U of T.
Thank you. I saw you nodding. So everybody knows who Merrick Gertler is.
Yeah. Obviously.
You threw me off there. Sorry.
My bad. I was, during the school year, I was helping with a strike. And, we were asking U of T to be more transparent with their investments. We wanted them to be forthright and tell us and show us that they were actually making steps towards change. Now, for those of you who don't know how U of T works, it's a bunch of different colleges and they all are kind of one big thing. So we were going one by one to those who had their own individual endowment funds. And we would go to them and we handed them our demands, and we went into one of them. I won't name drop. I've still got a year left. I'd rather not shoot myself in the foot here. But we went into one of them and they go, "Oh no, we've completely divested. We're completely done." And we just kind of look at them and we're like, "Well, hold on, that's not true." They're like, "Yes, it is." And then they publish something saying that. And then we go and we email them the next day and we're like, "Hey, indirect investments still count." And all of a sudden, the article comes down, everything's hit. We're like, well, all right. But I think this speaks to something really important with Ecocide law and greenwashing. At its core, this is an issue of perception, how we are perceived and how those around us perceive us. The college that hid that wanted us to believe wholeheartedly, because it was better for them, for our perception of them, to be that they had completely divested. With a law against ecocide, and why it's so important that this is in the international courts, is that, and again, forgive me, I'm not an expert, but corporations thrive on their image. Consumers don't want to buy from a company that they think is actively harming them or doing bad things in the market. It's not necessarily consumers will bounce back, but they take a hit in profits. And essentially what I'm trying to say is that by making this an international law, we're changing their fundamental cost-benefit analysis. When they break this law, they are dragged onto the public stage. They are forced to be perceived for their harm to the environment in an international sphere. So not only hurting their bottom lines, but also helping the environment. And greenwashing, again, is to that same effect. It's that same belief that we do the minimum acceptable amount, or not even the minimum acceptable amount, and expect that consumers and youth agree that this is okay or this is enough, because it's not. And you'll have to forgive me for not incorporating more exact examples of greenwashing, but think the perception point was a little bit more poignant.
That was great. Thank you, Anna. I'm just noticing the time, so we do have another round of questions, but I'm hoping we can keep them a little bit short because we want to keep this presentation to under an hour. With that in mind, I'm going to put the question back to Lisa. Lisa, can you please tell us what does the recognition of the right to a healthy environment mean for business?
So thanks, Dana. I'm sort of thrilled to read Bob's work in the ICGN paper on biodiversity as system risk, because he kind of answers the question for me, so I didn't have to do very much homework. I mean, basically, the right to a healthy environment is first and foremost an obligation of states, because human rights law is binding on states, but businesses also have a responsibility to respect human rights, and the national legal frameworks that states put in place have to provide victims of corporate abuses with access to effective remedies. And the corporate responsibility applies to all internationally recognized human rights. So we know that corporate activities like rampant deforestation, chemical and plastic production, fossil fuel exploitation, and so on can directly jeopardize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And if I look at Bob's great work, it spells out what the resolution adopted by the General Assembly asks businesses to do, and it calls for businesses to adopt policies, enhance international cooperation, strengthen capacity building, and continue to share good practices in order to scale up efforts. But I think we can take it a step further and look at this through the lens of due diligence responsibility. So there is a responsibility on businesses to conduct environmental and human rights impact assessments, to incorporate due diligence regimes and provide access to information to affected individuals and communities, and to engage in community consultation and transparent decision-making. And I think this is really critically important. I think just a final quick point that's maybe a really obvious one. Businesses should respect and proactively advance the right to a healthy environment, not only as a moral or a legal imperative, but as a responsible business practice. And just to quote one CEO that has said, "Smart business leaders understand that healthy companies depend on a healthy planet and healthy societies." And so recognition of a right to a healthy environment is really a win for businesses. But I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Bob, do you want to speak any more on that and maybe tell us about other actions investors are taking on biodiversity laws?
Just Lisa's point about the UNGP's guiding principles and now this right, that the fact that the UN has passed this declaration on the environment as a human right, essentially, it will be incorporated into the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which is directly referenced in a number of European pieces of legislation in this space. So that form of soft law is finding its way into hard law in the European Union. And that's a very important point, I think. Beyond that, investors, the main activity our investors are taking on is through stewardship activities in terms of identifying companies that they will engage on a range of biodiversity issues and doing so in a collective manner. So in a way that where money speaks. That's just getting underway now. It's what they call Nature Action 100+. The solution set or demand set is just now being written up, and the first 100 targets are being selected. So that's happening now, but that'll be the main strategy going forward. There's also one of the pieces of this will be the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So institutions will be required or asked to disclose, make the kinds of disclosures that Lisa was talking about in terms of governance, policy, metrics and targets, impacts. Those disclosures will be coming. The French bank BNP Paribas has already produced an excellent biodiversity report in this space. And those kinds of disclosures are coming rather quickly. The other piece, and this might be the segue to Harry, I'm not sure Harry's going next, but more and more of the large asset owners are building their own private equity or alternative investment spaces where they will be able to invest in companies that will be more likely to provide the kind of solutions to nature challenges that we need. I think mitigating the risk is not enough. We need solutions and we need game changers. And that was the title of our paper back in January was 10 game changers for biodiversity. And we saw Ecocide as one of those game changers. We wanted 10 because I think we're all feeling a little bit at sea or frustrated or saddened and angered. And this idea, we just can't sit around wringing our hands going, what do we do? What do we do? Here are 10 things we can do. Let's go and do them.
Thank you. And yes, I will turn it over to Hari if you want to follow up. My question for you is, what do you see as the long-term potential impact of Ecocide law on environment, business, and society?
Sure. I'm going to try to wrap in some of what we've heard in this conversation as well. I think fundamentally, it's a simple answer, right? It is fundamentally a piece of the puzzle to change the mindset of the value of nature. I think coming into some of these points, I think Lisa talked about sort of the due diligence and process related functions, which relates to what you were talking about in terms of greenwashing and the divestment strategy, which is that without a fundamental shift in mindset around the underlying value that nature provides to inform how businesses operate and investors operate, we're going to get into box ticking, which is going to be greenwashing, right? And the reason that happens is because the education on the front end is insufficient to help people understand that the underlying asset base that's creating all this value is nature. I think the future of criminalizing ecocide is to help people understand what that asset base is and what value it's providing for the global economy, which then fundamentally shifts how people make decisions in corporations in the financial sector. I'm going to give a couple of examples of how that works. So you talked about TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, and we're super excited at the release of that in the fall. So I've worked in the climate and nature space for 20 years. When I started my business in 2012, we would get about a half a dozen calls a year from companies asking about climate cost curves, reduction activities, disclosure. In 2018, in September, I was in Mike Bloomberg's office when the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure was released. The week after I came home from Climate Week in New York, I got 50 phone calls from publicly listed companies that were telling me that their institutional investors were asking them about climate disclosure because Mike Bloomberg, who they respected as a billionaire, and Mark Carney, who they respected as the governor of the Bank of England, told them that it's part of their fiduciary responsibility to consider climate as a risk. And what I believe is that when TNFD is released, companies are going to recognize and institutional investors are going to ask the question again, what are you doing about nature-related financial disclosure? Because the downside risk for our investment portfolio is real, and now we have a framework to understand how real it is. But also the upside value creation in terms of the future solutions is also real and material. So coming back to this whole underlying issue of we need a fundamental shift in mindset from governments, from corporations, from investors to recognize that over half of global GDP relies on nature. We are destroying it at a pace equivalent. We're destroying it by spending over half of global GDP, actively destroying an asset base. And I'm a marine biologist by training, never went to business school, but I would be surprised if they're teaching at Wharton to build a successful business, you destroy the asset base in the process. And that's what we're doing fundamentally in the global economy. So we just need a different mindset. And I think this movement will help sort of address that notion that nature is underpinning all of this. And as we continue to destroy it, we are eroding future progress and growth and of our economy.
Thank you so much, Hari. Final question for Anna, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So Anna, from the youth perspective, can you tell us what is the significance of this moment in time? What should people who are watching here or online later take away from this conversation?
I'm going to do my best to keep this short and sweet, but 3 things. 1, my generation, my peers, the current youth, are at the cusp of entering the job market. We are about to be thrust into this world, thrown into the deep end, and we suddenly are going from an academic space to a real one. And so keeping in mind how important it is to remember that this is just as important as profits, that this is just as important as anything else. Number two, we're really running out of time. At the risk of sounding fatalistic, which, you know, it was a little surprising that I end up being the not pessimist, but let's call it realist at the table. Canada thrives on an economy of destruction. Our market, our primary revenue base is founded on this concept of destruction and usage of nature in a way that's not sustainable. So as we enter this job market, we also have to remember that ideally it's going to fundamentally shift within our lifetimes. So we need to be flexible and adapt. And I know it's been a couple years since COVID, but dare I say we have to pivot. I know, I'm getting chills just from saying it. And three, this can all be really intimidating. This can be really scary and overwhelming and terrifying. But at the end of the day, we are all smart and capable people. And we have at least 10 things to do at the very minimum. And there are so many more and so many different ways to get involved. So find the way that makes you happy, but do something. Thank you.
That's a really great note to end on. Thank you, Anna. Does anyone want to add any final things that you didn't get the opportunity to say before we open it up to questions? Ari?
I just want to add a note of optimism, which is reflective of the passion that you demonstrate, Anna. What I hold to be true is that the generation that's coming into the workforce right now is thinking about things in a different way and actively trying to pursue a shift and change. And I find it tremendously, you might feel that it's daunting, but I find it tremendously exciting. If I look at where we're sitting right now in terms of building the businesses that we're building, we have a tremendous labor challenge. And with the orientation of youth that are graduating out with these principles in mind, it's going to fill that labor gap. And it's always a struggle when you graduate from university and you're entering the job market. But at this moment, there are hundreds of thousands of jobs sitting, waiting for the sustainability transition. And it is a super exciting time to be entering that space with the passion and drive that you have and your cohort has. So I remain optimistic there. And secondly, back to the solution side, is that there are a tremendous number of solutions that are available today that aren't being fulfilled because of the labor shortage. I'll give you a simple example in the climate space, right? In North America right now, rooftop solar penetration is less than 5%, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's cheaper, it's better, it's net zero. Everything makes sense from a logical perspective, yet in the US, it's 2% penetration. It makes no sense. We just need more people to go out and install and figure it out and get, Jigger to release more debt funding from the Loan Program Office of the Department of Energy. And it should have happened 10 years ago. I mean, not 10, but 5 years ago when the price, it's ridiculous. We just need to go out and do it, and we need people to go out and work to do it.
So just say I think that's not all solutions are there, but many of the solutions are there. It's a matter of scale. That's a scale game right now. But I'll just mention in 1980 there was a movie came out called The Big Chill. I'm sure you've never heard of it. But it was about a group of college friends who had been out of school for 10 or 15 years. They come back for the funeral of a friend. And it's a small town in South Carolina. And they'd all been activists in university. And they'd all gone out into the workforce and found they could not exercise their values in the workplace. And they were all bitter about it. And I think back to those days and where we are now, that's not true anymore. To Harry's point, there are jobs in this space, and there's a desperate need for labor. I find that's one optimistic note that you have opportunities now that didn't exist in 1980. So go and get them. Yeah.
Lisa, did you have any final remarks before we turn it over to questions?
No, other than just to note that I am sitting in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, and I would love for Hari to come and launch a science-based, accurate information campaign to help Albertans with the massive struggle that we face here, particularly post Monday's election.
The invitation has been extended. All right, so does anyone have any questions? We've set up some microphones on the side. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. So after talking about the mindset shift in looking at nature as more than just a resource to extract for money, how can we reach people already in the workforce who have already been trained in the fossil fuel industry, for example, that we need to transition and that it's not such a bad thing? So we're talking about the youth today. It's become a lot more normalized to see nature as something more than just money. So how can we reach the people already educated with the extractivist mindset?
That's such a great question. Did you want to direct it to anyone in particular or open it up?
Whoever wants to answer.
Perception. Honestly, I think the best way to reach people who already have one understanding of something is to make them see or make them perceive something in a new way. Like the Medicare or Medicaid system in the States. Technically, it's government healthcare. But there are a lot of people in the US who would rather do almost anything than have government subsidized healthcare. There are so many smart and capable people out there. And yeah, a lot of them do have that extractivist mindset, but perception and showing them that change isn't bad through, their peers and other people in that field is incredibly powerful.
I think that's really important. I'm going to be much more pragmatic about it, though. Incentives. We just need to incentivize behavior change, which means you need to tie compensation, bonuses, institutionalization of the shift, training costs, everything. You just need to pay for it.
I think, sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I think this is really actually comes back into why the conversation around ecocide law is so interesting too, because you have perception, you have incentives, but then if you have an international criminal law that says this is the line, do not cross it, everyone is on the same page. Everyone is advancing and moving in the same direction, and we've kind of drawn where our boundary is. So I think that it's a really great question, and perhaps considering the crime of ecocide might be one of the answers, one of the ways. Do we have any other questions? Oh, Judy Green.
Hi, I'm Judy Green. I'm a director and political advisor for Stop Ecocide Canada. I'd actually like to respond to that as well, because I think you're on the right track, but we also have to look at where our subsidy money is going. We need to be subsidizing what we want to see in our economy. Right now, we're not doing that. We're subsidizing to the tunes of billions of dollars our own destruction, quite frankly. And I'm feeling a little sensitive right now. I'm from Nova Scotia. My province is on fire. And I wanted to pass something along from you that Elizabeth May passed on to me from a briefing with Bill Blair today. The average number of losses in hectares of wildfires all across Canada for the month of May. It's about 150,000, and that's a 10-year average. This year, this May, in our country, the excess is already over 2 million hectares. And the wildfire index and the climate and predicted weather patterns for the rest of this year could be catastrophic. This is a moment in time when you're getting people who normally are somewhat insulated from the effects of the crisis are seeing their friends and family affected. This is a moment in time where we can do something, where we can shift that perspective. And we can do it one conversation at a time, or we can do it by pushing legislation forward and support for Stop Ecocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I don't know who was first. Can we put it over to this side and then any other questions, if you can stand up at the microphone?
Hello. My question is for Lisa. I'm not a good public speaker, so I wrote it down. What advice would you give to young lawyers who want to do this work and are passionate about environmental and sustainability practice and advocacy, but they haven't had the good fortune to crack into the very few organizations in this country, almost all of which are in Toronto or Vancouver, that litigate on environmental issues?
Thanks, and I'm sorry that I can't see you, but it's a really great question and I appreciate it. I am not an environmental lawyer, and I few years ago just decided that I wanted to pivot, to use Anna's words, because I was just being kept up at night and felt that I needed to direct this energy somewhere. The thread from throughout my career has been accountability, and I happen to focus on, the most serious human rights violations and using the law to address those. And so I just sort of struggled, and I spoke to everybody I knew when I decided to leave the UN to talk to other people working in this area. I didn't really want to become an environmental lawyer or retrain. I wanted to use my own background and skill set to contribute to these discussions. And that's how I came to learn about the proposal to criminalize ecocide. So I think I would say, speak to just everybody you know. I'm happy to have a conversation if it's useful at all. But I think, follow your passion, find the issue that drives you most, and speak to a wide network, because I think that's the way that you'll find your path. But again, I'm happy. I think we've all been there one way or another in finding our paths in life. But I think it sounds like you've got a contribution to make, and there's got to be a place for you to make it. So I don't know, Dana, if you wouldn't mind connecting us, if that's useful, I'd be happy to follow up after the panel. Absolutely. Hari?
I just want to add a little piece, is that I think this comes back to a mindset shift as well, in that we often think about careers in the environment as a path that's environmentally focused, rather than think about every career path should have an environment component in it, and it should be integrated. So I think when you think about environmental law, you think about the advocacy part, you think about those kinds of things. When we engage lawyers, we focus much more on resource rights and tenure, on transactional lawyers that understand the interface between the supply and demand side are hugely valuable, but they don't come into this space necessarily. So I think getting training in sort of material legal areas and then applying that with an environmental lens will be hugely valuable. So think more expansively about what the opportunities might look like, and not just kind of the advocacy component.
Thank you so much. So this is going to be our final question, and then we're just going to open it up to a reception format. You are welcome to come up and speak with our panelists. And if you did want to connect with Lisa, please come and talk to me as well. I'll give you her contact information.
There's actually one other one. I don't know if you could take both, but I think you're sitting and waiting as well. So if he if you can squeeze in one other after me, that would be great.
Sure.
If that's possible. Okay, I don't know if you, I just wasn't sure if you had seen him. Okay, so my name's Tamara Lawrence. I'm a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. Thank you very much for organizing this panel. We absolutely need a law of ecocide. And I would like to identify another industry that is contributing to this ecocide. Today, this morning, I was in front of the EY Center because the EY Center is what kicked off the 2-day CANSEC, the largest weapons largest weapons fair in North America, takes place in our capital every single spring. And this is thousands of industry people from around the world that are selling their weapons. And these are fossil fuel powered weapons, right? Fighter jets, tanks, warships, guns and ammunition. They use critical minerals. And this event is being coordinated and subsidized by the federal government. CADSI, the big industry association of aerospace and defense and securities, works with the federal government to put on this arms show. We could be having a green technology fair at the EY Center instead of having a weapons fair. And then you were talking about the state of our economy. We spend now a record high. Our military spending has increased by 70% in the past decade. To now we're spending $35 billion, and we spend 10 times more on the Department of National Defense, on the military, than we spend on the Department of Environment and Climate Change. So our federal government's priorities is weapons and war. It's not on green on greening. So I would like to hear from the two gentlemen on the panel about the issue of our highly militarized economy, particularly the United States and Canada, and the fact that we really can't green weapons and warfare. We need to abolish it. We need to abolish it. So I would like to hear about if the funds that you're involved in, the corporations you are working with, are weapons manufacturer, and what you're doing about that, because they are contributing to ecocide, not just killing the planet, but also killing people. Thanks.
So the field of responsible investment going back 40, 50 years prior to my entry into the space was really initiated by faith-based investors focused on the Vietnam War. So there's a long history of weapons exclusions, or excluding weapons manufacturers from portfolios. A lot of that has focused recently on, there are UN resolutions around what constitutes illegal weapons. So quite often cluster munitions, landmines, that kind of thing. I can't speak for our members. I know that when I ran a fund, we had a weapons exclusion. So that's about all I can say about this. It's a difficult time to make this case with the war in Ukraine. But just to say, this has been a long strand of peace activists in the responsible investing space have made a mark in terms of putting that line in the sand of not investing in companies that involved in war.
Thank you, Bob. I think just to be respectful of everybody's time, we're going to move on and open up to the reception, but you are welcome to come speak with any of the panelists. This is a great opportunity to ask your questions or make those connections. So I would just like to thank our sponsoring parties one more time. There were some people who weren't in the room when we first started. So I want to acknowledge again Elizabeth May and the Green Party of Canada. I would like to acknowledge again Patrick Weiler and the Liberal Party of Canada, Monique Posey and the Bloc Québécois, and Alexandre Boularice of the NDP. Thank you so much. We love this cross-party participation. We are so happy to have you here. We'd like to thank CPIJ, Canadian Partners for International Justice, and Stop Ecocide Canada. Thank you all for being here, and please enjoy some food and drink. I would also just like to note that if you have any questions about Stop Ecocide, you're welcome to come up and speak to myself or Judy Green here at the back, or Anna. Again, and if you would like to contact Lisa, please come and talk to me. Thank you guys so much.